right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Summer Burton, and I'm with Literacy Link South Central, your hosts for today's online workshop called When Life Impacts Learning, Trauma, Poverty, and Cognitive Load in Adult Education. We are thrilled to be welcoming over 50 attendees from across the province at today's session, and they are representing community-based school board and college sector Get Set programs, e-channel programs, our regional learning networks, the provincial support organizations for literacy, employment services, workforce planning boards, and more. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge our funder, the Ministry of Labor, Immigration Training, and Skills Development. It's with their support that we're bringing you today's session. Now, a quick bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please mute your mics. But if you have questions, do not hold on to them. Use the chat to record them, and we'll have time throughout the session and certainly at the end to go through those questions. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that while we're gathering virtually today from many different locations, the lands we live and work on are the traditional territories of diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people across Turtle Island. We recognize the enduring relationship that Indigenous peoples have with these lands, waters, and communities, and reaffirm our commitment to learning, reflection, and meaningful action towards reconciliation and respectful relationships. Those of you who joined us for Pathways to Empowered Learning, Cognitive Strategies, Metacognition, and Inclusive Practice in March will already know our speaker for today. Trish Derby is a graduate of the University of Waterloo and Queen's University with additional qualifications in special education. She brings over 3 decades of experience as an educator, trainer, and a learning enthusiast across all of her years, an extensive career in education. She currently serves as United for Literacy's regional coordinator for Nova Scotia and is also the chair of Literacy Nova Scotia. Her expertise lies in special education and structured reading education, and she provides tailored support to adult educators and literacy practitioners in both Nova Scotia and Ontario through her organization's CELTAG Education Group. Trish, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to be presenting this to you today, so I will jump right in. My goal with this session is that I'm providing you with strategies that you can implement immediately, or take your time and learn more about them. And at the end of the session, I'll address some of the resources that will be available to you as well. So we'll jump right in. So this is the overview of the session. And in terms of an introduction, I've worked very hard I was very intentional that this isn't going to be something that would trigger people. And so I use the words healing-centered more often than I do trauma-informed, although you will see that pop up in here. And I don't speak about traumatic events. I speak about impact, and with the hopes that, everyone is feeling that this is a safe space. So we'll take a look at the brain. The brain's a big part of any of my sessions that I do. For anyone that was in the last session, you know that I did start off with a brain slide, and I will today too. Talk a little bit about trauma in a very general term, its impact, or how the brain reacts to trauma, the impact being cognitive overload, and then the majority of this session will be spent with strategies and best practices that we can use to support our learners. So the brain, it is designed to do the following: to sense, to process, to store, to perceive, and to act on information from both external and internal environments. And I show this all the time because to me it makes really a lot of sense when we think about cognitive skills, how people learn, how they take in information, why things like universal design for learning is important, multisensory teaching is important. It's because of how the brain is designed. And whenever we can be intentional in our practice to keep that in mind, it can be very helpful and beneficial to our learners. Also, the brain works well when there's a safe, structured, predictable learning environment. It allows concepts to stick in the brain, and when that happens and connections are made in the brain, then the learning happens. There's another little thing about brain functionality, and for the most part, I focus on the frontal lobe and the temporal, because they're both involved in the impact part. And as you likely know, the frontal lobe is very important for our functions day to day in terms of creative thinking and problem solving, our personality, basically our executive function skills. The temporal lobe can be a bit of a nuisance because it holds our memories and can mess things up for us, which is why, when we start talking about the impact of trauma, the temporal lobe gets involved and sticks its nose in things. And I speak to it that way because I have shared this kind of information with my learners, and I'll touch on that in this session as well. Some of these are some fun facts. I found it fascinating when I started doing the research for this several years ago, and I did it for a personal reason. I wanted to know why I had stuff happen and my executive functioning skills went out the window, and it was, and I stayed there for too long. My doctor called it a tipping point, not a medical term, but so I was fascinated. It's like, what happened? Why did that happen? So I did a lot of research, and the first one just fascinates me because every time I think about that there's as many connections in a single cubic centimeter of brain tissue as there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy, it's like, how is that possible? When I told the learners that, they were quite fascinated too. But it is such a complex organ, and there's always great research being done about the brain and things that we can learn from it. But it also, because it is so complex, it helps us understand why when someone is impacted by a traumatic event, it can be deeply embedded in our brain. Not because they want it to, but because that's what can happen. A lot of development happens in the brain, the building blocks, the links creating the systems, and then those systems are needed so the brain regulates all of our functions, right? Our breathing, our walking, speaking, learning. And they are organized from most simple to most complex, which makes a lot of sense. And the development of the functions is also sequential. So prior events impact future development. And that's important given what we know about how, we learn from the time we're in kindergarten to wherever we stop, being in school, but we're always learning. And so the brain plays a big role in that, obviously. So the brain development in infancy is very important. It lays the foundation for future development. And those neural pathways are forming at a great speed, but they depend on repetition of experiences, which is why, we start reading to our little ones as infants, talking to them, introducing them to vocabulary in an auditory manner. And, it makes sense when I taught junior kindergarten. I mean, we sang so many songs, right? About the alphabet, about vowels and consonants and weather and anything that we could put to music, we did. And it was that repetition of experience. And repetition is also important for adult learners, and there's different ways we can do that with them. So by age 3, that brain is almost its adult size. And again, by age 5, it's 90% of its adult size. And it has its most plasticity in infancy and early childhood. But the good news is that there's plasticity still available for our adult learners. And we'll take a look at that today as well. So those neural pathways, there's a lot of pruning that happens, eliminated to increase efficiency, right? They want to clean things out, the coding of the neural pathways to strengthen them. And then all of this happens so that the school-age children can start to master more complex skills. Adolescents, obviously, what they're learning in school is definitely more complex than what they did in grade 5 now that they're in high school. And so there's another period of accelerated development and more pruning of those pathways. So the definition of trauma is simply, even though it's not a simple thing, an exceptional experience in which powerful and dangerous events overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. There are other definitions. I like this one. It's generic without getting right into details about it. What I learned when I first started doing the research about it, and it made a lot of sense to me when I thought about it, is that it's about the impact of the event, not the nature. And so you won't hear me speaking about the nature of events. Again, to create a safe space for people here, but it's the impact, right? And people can be impacted in different ways. Someone can have, two people can have the same nature of event and have a completely different impact. And that's okay. That's just how they adapt and cope and take it all in. Doesn't mean one is better than the other, but it's about the impact. And then there's this thing called adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. And I've made the assumption, and I've been right a lot of the time when it came to my adult learners, that many of them did experience adverse childhood experiences. I don't need to know what they were, but I know that they happened, and those accumulate. So trauma is real for people, and it's prevalent, and it's super toxic to the brain and the body. Cortisol keeps getting released when it shouldn't be. That's supposed to be a short-term hormone that's released to help us when we're in a scary space. And if it sticks around, it's really quite toxic. And trauma can affect development and learning in a multitude of ways. And we're going to take a closer look at that. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the good old, flight, fight, or freeze. I think we learned that a long time ago, that during extreme stress, we may react via one or all three of those. But as I mentioned earlier, our minds and bodies, they weren't designed to remain in this state for long periods of time. It's unhealthy. So when a child's exposed to some trauma, been impacted by trauma, the brain shifts now from development to a stress response. So we think about, some of the adults that come through our doors. It's quite possible that there are things that they haven't learned or they don't know how to do because of an impact of trauma, and it impacted their development, their learning development. And it can accrue, and that's the scary part, right? And so now their cognitive load is being impacted in a negative way. So when this happens, the limbic system, it takes over. It's like, oh my gosh, something bad's happening. We're going to shut down that frontal lobe where all the good thinking happens and all of our strengths and our executive function skills. We're shutting that down. It's offline, it's done. And so now the mind and the lower brain functions take over. So we can hopefully still breathe and walk and, and we can do some thinking. It's just not going to be the high level thinking we were accustomed to. And because the mind holds all those delightful memories, it can mess things up too for people. I actually used this when I shared it with my learners, but I didn't ever use the word trauma. I spoke or poverty. I talked about stress and anxiety because they could relate to those words. And they found it really interesting, and it actually helped validate a lot of things for them about why they missed chunks of learning during their academic journey. What we see in trauma-impacted adults is that many of them will move through life in a state of persistent anxiety and hypervigilance. Some of them know they're hypervigilant, some of them don't know, because the brain watches for danger, but you don't always know that it is. They may consciously be on the lookout for danger or waiting for that second shoe to drop, right? It's like, all of this stuff keeps happening, so I won't be surprised. Let's just look around and wait for that shoe to drop. They can be very hypersensitive to changes in voice, body posture, facial expressions of others. To the brain, that's a warning sign. So I always give the example of, what if I'm standing in class or for some reason I choose to cross my arms? It's actually not something I do very often, but that could be to a learner. It's like, uh-oh, we know bad things happen when we see that someone stand like that. And that doesn't mean don't cross your arms, but they are hypersensitive to that stuff. I remember having learners ask me straight out, will you yell at me if I get things wrong? And besides that being horribly heartbreaking, it reminded me, to use a calming voice as much as possible. So if your brain's busy watching for danger, then the central nervous system is preparing for you to take action. it's got you on high alert, that your executive function skills aren't working, that leaves not a whole lot of bandwidth for learning, right? And we see over and over again how trauma destroys the ability to learn. It definitely can kill curiosity and it can inhibit exploration. And it's one of the reasons why we see in some great programs for youth that are in custody, where they get to draw and they're writing graphic novels or comic books. For the first time ever, they have an outlet, and despite being in custody, which is not a great place, but they're able to express themselves, and they can't believe how much creativity they possess because it had been locked down for so long for them. So cognitive overload. I use these two words a lot sometimes to describe myself, right? After a super busy week where you're like, I don't have any bandwidth left. And it's more than multitasking, because we love to toss that word around too. Basically, it's what happens when the brain is asked to process more information than it can manage at one time. And if we go back to, that brain slide at the beginning that Trish likes so much, if it can't process, well, then it won't have anything to store. And if it has nothing to store, it won't have anything to retrieve, right? So we want to do what we can to manage that cognitive overload so it can process and then do all of its other stuff. So it shows up when the demands of a task, they exceed that learner's working memory capacity. We see it when learners are juggling gaps in foundational skills, or they're stressed out about life, or an unfamiliar capacity. So I see it a lot in the learners that I worked with one year where I taught them to read. And so they were missing gaps. They ended up being great readers by the time the school year was over. But it was very stressful at first because they knew that they should know what we were doing with consonants or vowels, but they didn't. And that is why I ended up talking to them about the brain and how there's a reason why you could have missed all of this when you were younger. So if that brain can't process the information, then either the connections are very weak because of the overload, or learning just isn't happening. So if the connections are weak, then the brain is storing it, but it's trying to find where it should land. Which is why sometimes we see our adult learners struggle to retrieve information. It's because it's landed somewhere it shouldn't have landed. And that was because of weak connections. So what you might see in an adult learner, the freezing or stopping of doing work, avoiding a task, rushing or guessing, right? And I used to see that a lot. They'd rather rush or guess than make a mistake. And then I would see some who were repeating mistakes. We could spend a lesson on division on Tuesday and pick it back up on Wednesday. And the connection didn't happen. Now, sometimes that's because people do have learning deficit or some cognitive processing issues, but it's also quite common if our adult learners are dealing with cognitive overload. They might say to us, this is too much. I don't get it. Or can you just tell me? I can't do this was a common one. And then for some of them, the frustration of why can't I understand this? And I'm hoping with the strategies today that you will see a road to where you can help them with this so that you can help them understand it. Other signs of cognitive issues, trouble remembering steps, difficulty focusing, slow processing. The bandwidth is limited, they're going to process slowly, which again comes back to the brain dumps it somewhere because really, you're not going to be retrieving it anyhow. So I'm just going to dump it. I don't know what to connect it to. And so that's not unusual either. Emotionally, frustration or anxiety, negative self-talk, withdrawal from class participation, anger, walking out of class. I did have a learner who his frustration would just boil up so much. And like all of my learners, I thought he was quite bright. But then his anger, he would lash out at his classmates and it would be a big thing. Then he'd storm out of the room. So we worked out a thing where when he was starting to feel that, he would kind of give me a look that I knew, and he'd get up very quietly as if he was going to the washroom and he'd leave. Now he'd always come back and check in with me. but he'd walk out very calmly. So everybody else was okay. And sometimes he came back and participated, but he needed a place to let it out. And so that was a really common emotional signal that I would see, and certainly the frustration and anxiety. So, it happens for so many reasons. I mean, cognitive overload. Adult learners, they might be learning new skills, but they might be learning about the skilled trade of plumbing. And you'll hear me refer to plumbing a lot, not because I'm a plumber, because I'm not, but I once did a workshop about using structured reading for people going into that skilled trade. So they're learning a new skill, but they still have to fill gaps because they didn't learn all that reading stuff when they were in school. We know that most of them, I would say, like I think most people right nowadays, managing stress, managing family demands. There's financial pressure. There's a lot of, fear about things. And then also just processing multiple demands at once. And yet, I would see in mine, and I imagine you do in yours, they don't want to give up on their classes. They know they have their goals, they know what they want to achieve, and they don't want to give up. But they're frustrated because they're not learning as fast as they would like. And that's because of the cognitive overload. It's not because they're not bright, it's just because there's just not enough room in their brain. So working memory overload, and that's where we see our learners, they can't hold on to multiple steps, right? Where it's, okay, some activity and there are 5 steps. That's a lot for them to read it, remember, and then respond. And we'll take a look at strategies to help with that. A processing breakdown where they need more time to respond or to process, but they also feel pressured, to answer quickly or to let you know that they're getting it or they're not getting it. And so they're having trouble integrating new information with prior knowledge, likely because the prior knowledge is stored somewhere that it's not retrieved. It's not that the connection isn't happening. So when they're integrating the new information, and the brain really doesn't know where to store it yet. Attention fatigue, the learners may appear easily distracted, or they can't sustain their focus on even short tasks. That happens. That happened, I would say, quite often in my class. Some days, I mean, they were learning a lot of stuff, especially learning to read at the age of 50. And so there were different things I would do to sort of take that load off. And then the executive function strain. The learner might have trouble starting those tasks. They might be completely overwhelmed looking at the instructions at the top of a page or a large text they have to read and respond. They might have a hard time organizing their thoughts or their materials. And that can also be a cognitive processing issue, but it's definitely a sign that we see in adults who have been impacted by trauma. So again, it's when we're asking the brain to do too many things at once, especially since some of those things aren't automatic yet, right? If they're still decoding words or having to recognize words in a manual about plumbing, because they're not there yet to recognize all of those words. So it's not automatic. So I'm asking them to identify words they don't know, and then we talk about it and we break down the word and we do all of that good stuff. They know what the word means when they hear it because they've heard it, but they don't always know what it looks like when it's on paper. And so stuff isn't automatic. And so the brain's like, I'm trying to figure this out, right? Sometimes I think it's like a slot machine where you're hearing the ding, 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 ding while it's trying to find its spot. And it's very frustrating for them. So they're trying to decode and comprehend and manage their emotions. And then there's always somebody in class who has the answer before them. I saw that happen often, and there'd be frustration. Filling the gaps in foundational skills while trying to learn new content. Excuse me. I would say that that's probably one of the biggest things that they're up against, right? Trying to learn to read or know how to break down words, do syllabication, and still learn what it's like to be a plumber or to to practice, to study for tests to be a plumber or for cake. So it's a lot. The brain's really doing a lot for them and it can't do it all. And we know that they're carrying life stress, the work, the family, the housing, finances. Our English language learners also are carrying a lot of life stress. So what can we do in our practice? So now we'll get into the meat of it. Before we strengthen any skills, we have to reduce threat and build safety. Because when our learners feel safe, now the brain can focus, which means it's paying attention and the learner's paying attention. And that means that now the brain can hold information, which is their memory, and then it can make meaning, which is the learning part of it. Those connections happen once it can hold the information. So we're going to take a look at different things that we can do for this. So we're going to look at strategies, for strengthening their attention, memory, and learning skills. And I bet you some of you are already doing things like this. They may not be called this, which is fine. And really, my goal with this session is that hopefully you'll find some new ones that you might want to try out with your group. See, and again, I don't know your learners, so some of them may not work for your learner or your classroom setting, and that's fine, but it's something to think about. So that 2-minute focus reset. So what is it? It's basically what it says it is, a short reset before learning begins. And so I might say to them, let's take 2 minutes to get ready to focus, or I'm just going to go grab some water, or just take a quiet pause. Sometimes, if I could sense it in the room, I'd say, you know what, we're just going to focus on one thing this morning. And I would tell them what it is, and we'd talk about it. So now they knew, okay, we only have to do this right now. We did do some deep breathing and stretching too, and we had some fun with that. That seemed to work. But it is a very healing-centered strategy, and it will help calm the nervous system. And then that signals to the brain, hey, we got predictability and control here. We're good. We can turn off that constant scanning, hypervigilance stuff. We're okay here. Trish has told us what we're going to do, and it looks doable, and she helps us a lot. So we're okay. Let's focus on that. And so when that learner's brain stops scanning for threats and allows the learner to focus, then yay, some learning happens. And things, connections can be made. The learning gets stored where it should be. The information gets stored where it should be, so it can be retrieved. So I use this strategy and others similar to it, either as a reset or sometimes just as a transition. If I was reviewing a concept and we'd spent, a significant amount of time on reviewing a concept, I wanted to know that they got it, that they felt comfortable with it. And now I was going to introduce the new concept. So I would do a little sometimes it was 5-minute focus, really. If they wanted to go, use the washroom, get a coffee and walk around for a minute, that was fine with me too. But starting easy for them, that helps to reduce the overwhelm, because at the end of the day, we want to reduce it to increase their focus. Single channel instruction. So again, we're trying to reduce overwhelm in the adults to increase focus. So basically what it is, reducing competing inputs. So you can speak or you can write, but not both at once initially. Or you may just be giving one instruction at a time and then pause before adding more information. And it works because, again, that whole impact of trauma increases distractibility, but the single channel instruction, that's going to reduce the cognitive load, the sensory overwhelm for the learner, and then things can start to happen. Now, I'm a big fan of explicit instruction, and you can still do it as a single channel instruction. So you're going to model the skill orally and then demonstrate it. So if I take a math example, I used to do order of operations with my learners, And to get them interested in it, I don't know if you remember, but it used to be how you had to answer a skill testing question if you won a really big prize and roll up the rim at Tim Hortons. And we visited our local Tim Hortons often. So I started teaching it during roll up the rim season. And so they were very into it. They wanted to learn in case they were the ones that won the car. And that worked really well. So I would talk about the skill, model it orally, and then I would demonstrate it on the whiteboard. So this would allow their brains to take the information at a slower pace because they did really struggle with something like order of operations. And then, provided the support to the learners who might be struggling to keep up. And now they have, oral and written instructions, but not all at the same time, because some of them don't know if they should be looking at the board or listening to me or looking at their worksheet and listening. So this way, it was just me talking about order of operations, and you're going to see this formula, and this is how we do it. And then it would be on the board. And then I would model doing it on the whiteboard. And then we would do some together, which is explicit instruction, until they were ready to fly on their own with order of operations. Attention anchors. So it's a consistent focus tool. And there's lots of different ones that you can use. And in here are some of my very favorites. Encouraging to use highlighters for keywords, whether it's in a text that they have to read and possibly respond to or write about, highlighting instructions. And that's a scaffolding technique where they know that they can look, they have the support right there in their document that they can go back and look to see what it is. Finger tracking while reading is fine, despite many educators decades ago saying it was an awful thing. If it controls or reduces the overwhelm in my adult learner, please track with your finger, because eventually they won't be. They'll have the confidence and the skills that they don't need to finger track. But at the beginning, if they're going to finger track, I'm all for it. I may say things like, okay, when I'm reading this to you, listen for this word. So that now I'm asking them to focus on that. In my previous session, you likely heard me talking about notebooks. Every learner had a notebook, and they set it up any way that worked for them. And we did word work in it, lots of vocabulary stuff, phonics stuff, comprehension. They would write in it, they would spell in it, and then they would put stuff like this in it. So their notebook was always open. And I didn't mark their notebooks. It was for them. And they took notes in there. I encouraged them. So some of them would have notes the way mine are. Like mine are of no use to anyone else. There's clouds and arrows and keywords, and they don't mean a whole lot. And I just wanted those notebooks to be for them. And that they could look back and go, oh yeah, I'm supposed to do this next. Some of them would actually highlight instructions and then actually write them down in their notebook or write down keywords. And it really worked well because, the annotations made sense to them and it helped make the connection. When people are writing, not typing, but actually writing, printing, whatever, that kinesthetic energy is helping make the connections to the brain. And so I encourage them to annotate about anything in their notebook or on a worksheet, or if they have a workbook, whatever works. So those attention anchors really help because, again, it's reducing overwhelm while increasing focus for them. And it gives the brain that place to land. So while they're looking at a document and there's 5 steps and yikes, this is a lot. And I don't know if I can do this, but then they can put their finger down and look at their highlighted instructions and go, okay, I've done step 1. So that's good. What's step 2? And they can go from there. And so that, again, it reduces the overwhelm because the brain's like, okay, we're good. We've done 1. Let's see what we have to do for 2. And it's important to show the learners that it's okay to look back at instructions. I mean, I know, a lot of what I was taught in school involved memory and memorization, and not everybody can memorize everything. Um, I think back, I loved history. Well, that was what my degree was in. And so many history teachers were like, you memorize the dates that Jacques Cartier landed here instead of talking about all the stuff around it, why he was here and the cultural issues. That's the kind of stuff that helps people remember, the whole thing about Jacques Cartier, instead of just memorizing a date. So they did find that annotating in their notebook really helped them a lot. And it actually helps to build their sustained attention gradually, which obviously is what we're aiming for, but it's a good thing, right? After a while, they don't realize that they're paying attention to it. And it's likely a task that maybe a month earlier, without starting to learn these strategies, where they might have said, it's hard, I can't do this, I'm going to take a walk, or why can't I understand this? Now all of a sudden they're staying focused, and now they're on to step number 3 in this document or assignment, and they've been paying attention. So it gives that pause in the brain that the brain needs. The learner feels safe because there is that scaffold in place for them where they can go, I'm allowed to look back and see what words I highlighted or what steps are next. And that's really important for them to feel safe. So helping learners hold and retrieve information, we want to try to strengthen their memories as well. So we've, say it, see it, and do it is part of explicit instruction. And it's also something that I would use when I was teaching reading to my learners. But it is kind of a multi-sensory encoding for them. Encoding being trying to lock it into their memory, right? So if it came to word work, I would say the word, then I would show it to them. They wouldn't see it at first, and then use the word. Can you tell me a sentence with that word? Can you write it? Can you speak it? That's just one example. You can do it with lots of stuff because not everybody is teaching their learners to read. But it does help whenever we can do that multisensory encoding to help the memory strengthen. It works because, again, the trauma impacts the working memory, makes it really weak, and multisensory input strengthens pathways. And, if we are doing an assignment together or a project, still getting people to talk about it, the say it part, see it up on the whiteboard or see it in what they're working on at their seat, and then doing it maybe together, not always alone. And they're getting to try it out, and it's all that stuff that really helps make the connection. So that's a great one for helping learners hold and retrieve information, because we want them to get good at that. I'm just going to pause for a drink of water. Just in time for the pause and repeat routine to help strengthen their memory. So it's basically building in rehearsal. And whether you're teaching, a small piece that they were reading or a text or a concept, pause. And then get the learners to repeat or explain it. And by repeat, it doesn't have to be, echoed perfectly. I found it actually works better when they just talk about it. And maybe I have to start them on that journey of talking about it. But when they tell it back to you or to their fellow student or in a group, the connection's happening and it's strengthening their memory. It's easier for the brain to retrieve that and go, oh yeah, you were saying that. Because it's not enough for them to just sit passively and hear me read something or teach a concept without them having tried it. They've seen it, they're trying it with my support, and then they're doing it on their own. But whenever you can pause and let them talk about it, like, what is it we're really trying to do here? Well, we're trying to break down these words, these long words, and how come, they don't follow the other rules that you taught us, that kind of thing. And that really helps them make the connection. So it's moving the information from their short-term memory to their working memory. And at the end of the day, with the majority of these strategies, you're going to see your learners building confidence because their learning will be visible to them and they're going to feel successful and empowered. And that's what we want, right? Because I know in my case with my learners, they didn't see a lot of success in their academic journey. And I mean, I was working with them when they were in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. So for them to start to build confidence through success was very exciting. Memory hooks are kind of cool. It's where we try to connect new learning to something familiar. And it can be something as similar as, this word reminds me of. And again, this was an example from when I was teaching them reading and we were doing a lot of word families. So we might come across a new word that may not have been spelled the same, but it would rhyme if you said it out loud. And they're like, hey, that reminds me of, that word that we did last week. And I'll be like, yeah, you're right. And I'm going to show you how it's spelled. And then we would end up talking about how come it rhymes when you say it, but it isn't written the same way. It's like, well, that's because English is weird and there's lots of different rules, right? So, but then it was something for them that word ended up sticking for them because it was so different. Or if, depending on what you're working on, if we can use real life examples from work or their family life or daily tasks, any of those things will help. When the memory hook happens, then again, those connections happen. So because trauma can disrupt memory retrieval, familiar connections help strengthen that recall. And it's kind of how when you lose something in your house, like your car keys or something else, and you start almost walking backwards about where you were and where you put things. I know I do that sometimes, and it'd be like, oh yeah, I remember I opened that cabinet. And sure enough, something was in the cabinet that didn't belong in the cabinet, but I did that backward thing and tried to retrieve my memory as I walked through it. So the important thing is that familiar connections can strengthen their recall. So externalizing their memory is another strategy. It's kind of like, well, I love it when I wrote what it is. Well, it's externalized memory. It's like having an external hard drive on your laptop, right? Where you keep, because you've run out of room and your memory in your old laptops, you have a hard drive to keep stuff. But in this case, it's a whole bunch of different tools we can use with our learners. So it's the checklists, it's the word banks, it's the graphic organizers, story maps, mind maps. I love checklists for me personally. I don't know if that was from having been a school teacher where you had to be organized. I thrive on checklists. And so my learners had their own version. Again, they would keep that in their notebook. Word banks were very helpful when we were going to be taking on, when we were doing a lot of social studies work, I would pre-teach vocabulary and they'd create a word bank and they'd find ways to annotate in those word banks so that it would help them remember. Graphic organizers. And for a lot of learners, just those tools alone can have a massive benefit to them, to their memory, to their learning. And again, we're talking here about strengthening memory, but the goal is to reduce that overwhelm, right? To reduce the overload in their brain. So these are not, they're supports rather than, it's not like anyone's cheating because you have a checklist or a word bank. They're supports. And when they realize that it's okay to have these, I found that they really embrace them. And it made me happy to see the kind of things, when they would show me their notebook, because I didn't mark it or anything, see their checklists and how they were able to draw their own connections that I didn't necessarily draw for them. So externalizing their memory, and there's so many great templates out there for them to use, but they really use them. And when it came time to maybe write about something or doing comprehension, that the story maps or the mind maps really help them too, because it helped them organize. It's a lot if that's not where your skill set is or your strength, and suddenly you can put little pieces of information in and it's starting to come together. So they're talking about it, they're writing about it, and connections are happening. And they reduce the pressure on the working memory, right? They don't have to commit all of that stuff to memory. And it's allowing for those connections in the brain. And again, we are slowly now supporting their independence and building their confidence. And it's really neat because sometimes they don't see it happening right away, but we do. And it's I found it quite exciting to see that. So meaning making, and again, we're strengthening their learning. So it's, the learners actively constructing understanding, right? Instead of, passively receiving information. And it is a really, excuse me, big piece of a healing-centered approach. And so in this strategy, where you preview, you learn, and you reflect. So now I'm starting to lead you down the road of metacognition and more scaffolding as well. Really important strategies to help our learners. So this preview, learn, reflect is just a very predictable learning cycle for them that we introduce. And so how I would use it is, the preview would be, hey, here's what we're going to work on today. And that, telling them that was probably someday some of the greatest gift I could give them, because it took so much pressure off of them. That they knew, because maybe yesterday we were doing that order of operations and it was so difficult, and I hope we don't have to do it again because I hate it. And today Trisha's like, yeah, no, we're gonna work on this today, and they're like, okay, good. But I would give them a little, almost a little agenda of what we'd like to tackle today. Will we get through it all? Maybe not, but this is where we're headed. And then the learning piece of it is, of course, the small guided tasks. I recommend, that we guide the learning through explicit instruction as much as possible. Sometimes it's hard to do for some subjects, no doubt. But whenever we can, use explicit instruction. And then the reflection part. So now we're starting to build up their metacognition skills. It's really important to ask them after a lesson or a task on something, what worked for you? What was easy about this? Why was it easy? And it might be, well, because I knew all the words. I knew those words. I'd heard them before, but I'd never seen them, but it made it easier. I understood what they meant. Great. But what was tricky? Well, it was tricky when I saw them because I didn't know that's what they were. Okay, good. So it's giving me a lot of information, but it's also getting them to think about their learning. And it was like, oh, so I do know stuff. I did know the vocabulary about that. They may not use the word vocabulary. And yeah, looking at the words was the tricky part. So I need to do more of that work on, syllabication or something like that. So this strategy works because it does build predictability for them. And predictability is safety and healing-centered approach. We're giving learners information about what they'll focus on. So that means the brain gets a break from being hypervigilant, scanning for threats. The executive function skills can come back into play instead of working from that old downstairs brain. And they also know what's coming next in class. And now it's strengthening their metacognition. We want them to get in the habit of thinking about their thinking and reflecting, because that's really going to help them as we start to talk about, why something is hard and that type of thing. So starting with something achievable. I'm a big believer in this. I do it when I train my tutors, and I did it with my learners. I think it is important, especially if you're going into a new task that's connected to a previously learned task, that if you can begin with a task that the learners can do, and maybe it's a review of that concept, and then start to build in or add the smaller challenges for it. I loved it when, I'd be working with a student, whether they were in grade 5 or one of my adult learners, and they'd say, "This is easy." I'm like, "That's great news. I'm glad it is." They didn't need to know that I moved down a grade level so that they'd feel good about it, or they were, word plot problems that we had worked on the previous week. All that mattered was they could recognize that it was easy. And we might start off, I would say to them, "Well, there's 12 questions on this page. What do you say we just do the first 4?" They're like, "Okay." And typically we would do all 12 because they were that easy, although they were slowly building up to the next step. But they felt good and empowered. And given, whether it's a student I've worked with a learning deficit or an adult learner, when they've struggled in school, and now I'm getting to work with them after school hours, they've had a long day. Our adult learners have a long day. It's important for their well-being that they're doing something that is coming easy. Now, that's not saying that I do something easy every day so that they're bored, but you know what you're doing in terms of the tasks that you're teaching them, or the concept. So you can pick and choose to make it work, but it's just a little bit of, "See, you got this." And when the brain gets that message that you got this, again, some relaxation happens. It's reducing that fear response, and it's building confidence in our learners so that when now they're going to be faced with a harder task, okay, we've got something to work with though, because remember, you got that one. So let's see how we can do with this one. So language that regulates. And I'm sure you're already doing this, but using calming, supporting language. Mark for confidence, and that's a big one too. But in terms of the calming or supportive language, it's things like, "Let's figure this out together," so they know they're not on their own in this. Or, "You're on the right track. Let's see what we can do next. Let's go back and see. So we got that. So let's see the next step. What are we missing here?" And this is one that I used often. This is new, but it doesn't mean it's hard, right? Because often you would put new stuff in front of your adult learners and they'd be like, "Well, this is hard," right? Because they've never seen it before, or they think they haven't, or they haven't made the connection to the previously taught concept. And it's like, yeah, it's new, but it's not necessarily hard. So we're going to take a look at it together. So when we offer that kind of verbal support to them, we're using that language so that it reduces the threat response for them. And now it's helping to build their trust and their persistence, because persistence is important. Marking for confidence. My learners loved to have spelling tests. I hated giving them because some of them would make mistakes and I didn't want them to feel awful, but that's what they wanted. So I never did red marks or focus on the errors. I would, focus on what they got right. And then we would chat about that, and they'd look and go, "Oh, I keep always spelling this word wrong." And I said, "Okay, so, what's a trick we can use to learn how to spell this word?" And so that helped them. And I used reflections as much as I could to help them see where they struggled. Right? I had one learner who could not spell the word pretty if his life depended on it. And it was the only word he struggled with out of all of the sight words. And he would write that out, 17 times, because of course he was 60 and that's what they used to make you do in school. And then, we would look and go, "Okay, what are things we can do?" So maybe we can remember, if we see the word that starts with PR and there's 2 T's in the middle, it's probably pretty. Or can we split it up into sounds that make sense to help us. And so those reflections did help, and he eventually got over that hump. But, the more he worried about the word pretty, the harder it was for him to write the word pretty. So their reflections are more important than me going, "Hey, let's break this word up into syllables," right? So we want to use their reflections to help them see where they struggled, because that's going to be a next step for us with them. So when we build that trust and we reduce the threat response, we're helping to strengthen their memory and feel confident. So, the move beyond what's wrong to what's strong. And I'm a firm believer in strength-based teaching, instruction is so important. And I definitely got that from being a special ed teacher because all the kids have a strength. And, it was tough. I would have to give the news to the parents that, hey, your child is struggling with this. But I would talk to the parents, obviously, about their strengths as well. But I made sure when I talked to the learner that my focus was on strengths. It wasn't, yeah, you scored really low on concentration, but you have great vocabulary. I just focused on you have great vocabulary, and this is how it's going to help you. And an example of that is I had a grade 2 student could not read, and yet on the Peabody vocabulary assessment, he scored at the high school level. Well, that's because he lived in a home with a lot of words and great vocabulary and people reading to him. So once he learned to read, he was off to the races because he had this rich vocabulary. He knew what it meant. And so he had strong comprehension skills, strong fluency. And it's the same kind of thing with any of their strengths, right? If our learners come to us with life experience, cultural knowledge, personal goals, those are all strengths that we can capitalize on, and we can show them how to capitalize on it. So I would, ask myself, and I still do, am I this lesson that I want to do with them, because I have stuff I've got to work through because, we've got funders and there's expectations, but am I increasing their cognitive demand with this assignment or increasing their safety and support? And obviously I want to aim for increasing their safety and support. And that I did find after a while becomes second nature, and you're likely already doing so many of these things anyhow to make your learners feel safe and successful. But it didn't take much. Every now and then I could tell that I was doing something that was increasing their cognitive demand. And I had to just, dial it back and maybe split up some of the lessons that I was going to do. So here's a quick try this tomorrow summary of what I've been talking about for, almost an hour. But, the 2-minute recess. Huh? Every time I went over this, I would call it recess. Reset, teaching in small chunks. Love that. And again, it builds understanding step by step, but it's also very powerful in terms of reducing the cognitive overload. Explicit instruction, the I do. So I model the skill, and I might model it verbally, and then I'll have it on the whiteboard and show them. So now they'll hear me again and see me do it. Then we'll do it practicing together. And to bring up the whole order of operations, that's what we did. They watched me do it on the board. Then I put another equation up, and they tried to guide me for the next steps. And we had some fun because I know a lot of adults who still can't do order of operations. So we laughed about it because it's a little bit different than what they were used to. And then once we got over those humps, then we did it together with the support. Adding visual supports, graphic organizers, flow charts, anything. And then wherever you can, build in repetition, right? We want to reinforce that learning. We want to build their confidence, and we definitely want to improve, their retention. And offering choice. I'm a big fan of choice because, again, most of our learners, if they had some tough times in school, they were rarely given choice, right? It's like, this is what we're doing today, and you're going to like it. And so I love being able to offer them choice when I could. And it's empowering for them. And also, depending on what it is you're working on with them, there are different things that they can do. And thankfully for technology, some of them might just want to listen to it or watch it or actually work it out themselves, write it. But for sure, whenever you can, model or fit in reflections with them, and it can be, what did I learn? Like, what new skill did I gain today? And start. I won't lie. I mean, it was slow at first to get them to do it. I think because no one's ever asked them that question. They've never had to think about what did I learn. Um, were there any things that we did today that helped you? And I'd be like, well, you know what? When you did it on the board 3 times and then we got to try it with you, that helped. I'm like, okay, good to know. And then, what can they do differently next time? And how will I use what I've learned? So making those connections. So this is just a quick graphic of explicit instruction, and I'm a big fan of it. So the I do, the we do, the you do, and then getting them ready for on the job. So the goal is that with the guided practice and the hands-on support and independent practice, we are truly taking them from instruction to application. So now building persistence. So it's not about working harder, and yet I think that's what we always think that it is. It's about supporting learners to stay with tasks when they become difficult. And that was definitely a challenge I have with my adult learners, right? They will often disengage when they feel overwhelmed. That's when we see the whole, I can't do this, this is hard, just tell me what the answer is, Trish. But we can teach persistence through intentional strategies, and just as important, they are healing-centered strategies. So normalize struggle. That's a really important one. And it's okay to say to them, you know what? This is the part where many people feel stuck. Let's see what we can work on so you don't feel stuck, right? And we might have to go back a few steps to figure out what was going on, the part where they got it to where they didn't get it. And it's also okay to tell them confusion means your brain is working, and that's a good thing. So and I tell myself that often when I'm getting confused about something, right? It's like, okay, the brain's trying to figure it out for me. Relax for a minute, Trish. It's okay to be confused. So the whole let's look back, see where it started getting confused. And it works well because it does reduce that shame and fear. And it's also building the psychological safety, and it's supporting our trauma-informed learning, healing-centered learning. But also, when we ask them these questions, we're demonstrating to them that we're supporting them. We're teaching them how to reflect, which helps build their memory and their persistence, because we're showing them how to keep at it. It's okay that you feel stuck here, right? That's why I just said this is the spot where a lot of people get stuck. And that's all right. Let's see what we can do so that we get unstuck from here. Doesn't mean the unstuck will happen in the next 10 seconds or 10 minutes, but let's figure it out together. And we're training them and training their brains to go, it's okay. If I'm stuck, I can go back some steps and see where I got stuck. And we want them, because that's a skill they can carry into, their employment. And their real life, where we go back and go, okay, this is where I really struggled. So metacognition, again, building independence, strengthens problem solving. So we want to show learners to shift from answers really to thinking, what strategy can I try? And what do I already know? And so I, show them the kind of strategies that worked well for me. I joke that when I think back to studying for my exams in university, I think I copied out an entire textbook because it seemed to work for me. That's how I remember things. If I just read it and highlighted it, it didn't land. If I copied it out, it worked. Now, having shared that with my learners, a lot of them ended up being copiers too. But you know what? It seemed to work. So think alouds are really great, and they fit in with the whole explicit instruction, right? So even if it's as simple as doing a math exercise where you're, carrying over from the ones into the tens and actually showing it to them, but saying it out loud as you do it on the board helps for them. They're hearing it and they're seeing you do it, and then you can talk about it. There are strategy sentence starters. that we can encourage them to use. I've put some of these on index cards. I shared a lot of strategies with them. And so, a strategy I used to understand this was, or the most valuable thing I learned today was, and so on. Um, a new approach I tried was, highlighting, and it didn't work, right? Because it didn't help me memorize anything, even though highlighting isn't meant for memory, but it's meant as more of a scaffold support, but that's okay. They're now thinking about their thinking. And it's okay too to have them say, something that still confuses me is, or you know what, Trish, for me, they may not say it like this to improve my understanding, but to help me understand this better, what do I need to do? I think I need to do this. Is that right? So when we're strengthening those metacognition skills, using sentence starters if you want, but just get them thinking about their thinking. What worked? Or where was the place where I got stuck? Where did it become hard? What's helped me in the past? All of this becomes a natural process for them over time. So here's a little graphic on, planning effective lessons, and I put it in here basically because I got to, again, refer to metacognition and UDL and scaffolding, which is guided support, and the explicit instruction. And just as a reminder that, if you can reflect and review with them, what went well, what strategies did you use? And then we are able to give some supportive feedback and plan and help plan next steps for them. And those are all really important strategies for them and learning experiences. Now, in terms of metacognition and scaffolding, pre-teaching vocabulary whenever you get a chance, planning for multiple ways to present your information, and as always, if you can, break tasks into manageable steps. That's a biggie for helping to reduce overwhelm in our learners. So here we are into reducing cognitive overload and scaffolding. So getting them to understand the task and then identifying key ideas. And again, that can be the whole highlighting or annotating. Maybe they're dictating it to you, you're putting it on the whiteboard. Whatever works for your learners and for you is great. And then we start to apply the task. So if this resembles explicit instruction, it's because it kind of does. And again, and I probably sound like a broken record at this point, but reflect and check. Try to build in those few minutes at the end. Sometimes, after we had done a lot of work, we might end up doing a reflection that took the last 15 minutes of a class, but they wanted to talk about it. And so they're talking about it, connections are being made, they're learning about other strategies that their classmates use that worked well. And they get to see that everybody's using strategies, and they can see that I use strategies, and it's okay. But at the end of the day, it prevents overwhelm and it makes their progress visible. And it's a game changer when that happens for them, because then it's supporting their executive function. And again, that old brain, that downstairs brain, the mind, it's taken a break, thankfully, and we are running on all cylinders right now. And they have the bandwidth. And, they're learning so much about their own learning, which is significant. So to help, other things to help make progress visible and build that persistence in them, you can use checklists or step trackers where we get to say, hey, guess what? We just completed step 1. Those all help to build momentum, and they also reinforce their efforts. And by that, we're now increasing their persistence, because we don't want them to give up, right? It's okay to pause and say, this is really hard. And then we go back to that. Let's go back and find out where we were stuck. So we want to increase their persistence. It's okay to teach them to expect difficulty. So let's try some strategies first. Okay, let's work through their work step by step and remind them that confusion is progress. It's It doesn't feel like a good thing, but it's not a bad thing, right? It's progress. It means the brain's trying to help us sort it out and find information that maybe we learned about it before that we can apply to this now. And being stuck doesn't mean stop. Being stuck means, okay, you might want to have to do that 2-minute reset and then go, okay, so I understood it up until this point. So now this is where I'm stuck. I wonder what I'm missing. Or, try something new just to take that pause. So I would, before introducing maybe a new concept, this may feel challenging. That's okay. Okay, what's your next step as you're moving through? And what helped you keep going? And again, it's great for them to reflect on that. What helped you keep going? That's, excuse me, a really important thing. And as I think about our learners who are, prepping to write the cake, and those are big tests. I personally find them a barrier for adult learners, but a lot is asked of them. I'm actually working on some workbooks that I hope will be of assistance to you and to your learners with strategies to help them prepare directly for that kind of test taking, especially for the day of the test, right? And some of these strategies will be very helpful because if we can get them in the classroom used to the whole checking in, okay, what do I do when I get stuck? I look back. It's okay to look back even when I'm writing this test. It will help them. So the old choice, making choices, sometimes I'd say, do you want to read this passage or do you want to listen to me read first? Some of them would choose to read it at the same time I was, or just sit and listen to me. You can give me the answer to this in writing, or you can just tell me about it. I would say, we're going to cover math, reading, and history today. Let's start with math. If we don't get to history, that's fine, but let's get through math and reading. And again, it's because trauma typically reduces their sense of control, and they feel a sense of control when they have a choice, and that increases their learner engagement and their safety. Going back to, supporting our learners, provide that safe, structured, predictable learning environment, and we can build from there. So the important part is all of these strategies, yes, it helps them, reduces the cognitive overwhelm, builds other skills like their metacognitive skills, their persistence. But when that safety and calm exists, now they can retrieve information, right? Information that was previously learned, stored, and now maybe they can actually engage in creative problem solving. So this, all of it all put together is the rewiring of the brain that gives the learner more flexibility or more flexible responses and less defensive responses to learning and to life. So instead of saying, I'm stuck, I can't do this, I don't want to do it, give me something different. Now that we've been working on all of these strategies with them and supporting them, we have in fact been helping rewire the brain. And suddenly they are going to be less likely to say, no, this is too hard, I'm stuck, I don't want to do it. So the essentials of healing-centered care, promoting safety and trustworthiness, engage in choice and collaboration, teach and reinforce, and encourage skill building and competence, all a big piece of, or the essential pieces of healing-centered care. Focusing on their strengths, finding out what their interests are, what motivates them, what forms of praise do your learners respond best to? Mine, honestly, I'm not making this up. They love to get gold stars on their work. So I put gold stars on their work. And I think it's because they missed out on that when they were in elementary school. And so I was happy to put stars on their work. I've had some learners where that would have been like a hard no, but for one group, that's what they wanted. When we see a learner struggling, what do we think they need? Is it just a reset they need to take that pause? But based on their strengths that they have, empower your learners. And I know that you do a lot of goal setting and planning that we have to do, for our organization or our funder. And we also had other little goals that they had in their notebook. Sometimes they were just short-term goals that they wanted to work on, but it worked well for them. And it gave them also that sense of control, and we could check back in. One of the strengths I will say most learners come to us with is the fact that they have such an impressive vocabulary, right? I had one learner who wanted to be a mechanic like his dad. He was reading in grade 1 level, but he was in grade 12. So again, he was another one where he could tell you all about a carburetor, how to install it, what it does, but he wouldn't have read that word in a manual. And so we got him to that place. So teaching them to read, and then suddenly that rich vocabulary that our adult learners have rises to the top and really helps them with their academic success. So we want to build up their core skills, and I have more resources about this in the information that you're going to get. But the attention and focus, short and long-term memory skills, sequencing and processing is very important as well. Some people really struggle with that, putting things in chronological order. Problem solving, perseverance, and the ability to apply skills in the long term. And all of this feeds into their social skills and their hopefulness and their self-esteem. And, it can really, we really see how it changes the learner. And for me, it was a beautiful thing to see. So some little graphics that again have some little strategies, but there's more that you're going to get on attention and focus skills. We did some brain games that we had fun with. Some activities that focused on visual and auditory, goal setting exercises, mind mapping, active learning strategies where they would have discussions or debates. I'd give them some case studies about, something going on and how would you solve it. And they had a lot of fun with that. And we had to work our way up to that. One of the games that we would play often would be Yahtzee, because they actually found it very challenging with the dice. And it's like, do I have 2 3s? Should I try and roll to get 3 3s? But still, again, I was building their attention and focus by playing that, because they kept, playing it and getting used to it and building their persistence. Short and long-term memories, repetition and rehearsal, of course, chunking information, memory games and challenges. I took the curriculum for grades 6, 7, and 8, social studies and science. And using an AI tool, I got it to create the definitions to go with vocabulary, and we played games with that. And puzzles, some of them liked puzzles, some of them didn't. But, there's different things that you can do to help with those short and long-term memories. Storytelling, we had a lot of fun with that. Multisensory learning, whenever we can share information with our learners using the different senses, the better it is, and the metacognitive strategies. And honestly, after a while, their self-reflection becomes so natural that it's one of those moments where it's like, it's working. And they didn't always realize that these were metacognitive skills, but they realized that they were very aware of how they were learning and what was easy for them and what wasn't. Sequencing and processing. So sequencing exercises, instructions or tasks that have like that specific sequence, problem solving scenarios. We did case studies with that. They really enjoyed project-based learning. One year we had funding for 8 weeks in the summer, and it was all project-based learning. And it was pretty exciting to see how they, organized who was going to do what, or people doing it. We also had them participate in a science fair. My adult learners obviously never got to participate in one in school. And so we gave them some topics, some pretty simple STEM exercises and experiments, and they worked their way through it. And then they presented it at a science fair. So it's pretty neat, but it was fun to watch them, problem solve and sequence and do all of that, and seeing it all come together for them. So problem-solving skills, again, brainstorming sessions, group projects, reflection and feedback. It's interesting to see how they do that, and those things really help reduce that overwhelm. So the good news is that brains can change, and neuroplasticity is a real thing. And as I used to look at it, our learners may definitely be forever changed, but they're not damaged. And the reason why I put that slide in is because I would often hear people, kind of refer to someone who has been impacted by trauma as being damaged. And that's like saying they're suffering. They may very well be suffering, but it's not up to me to say that they're suffering. Maybe they're living with it. So I look at them and go, you are changed and you continue to change as a learner in our program. And it's not a damage, it's a change, and that's okay. Because we did used to look at things as, what's wrong with you, instead of thinking, I wonder what happened to them. And it's not that I need to know what happened, but I want to be cognizant of the fact that there's nothing wrong with them, but they've been dealt some blows likely in life. And so what can I do to help with that so that they can learn better? So keep it clear and predictable, clear expectations, same structure each session, your reflection again, am I helping the learner organize their learning or adding more for them to manage? And again, you're likely already doing that because you know your learners well. Keeping our systems as simple as possible to help manage that cognitive load. So, healing-centered, trauma-informed helps reduce the pressure on them, and it increases their control, which they need. And metacognition is building that awareness of what works for them. I study best this way, or, I learn best if I can see it, and then I get to read it myself and make notes. And it's great when you start to see them do this. Honestly, the notebooks, they were an amazing tool. And I really had not a lot to do with it except to give them one and say, hey, this is kind of stuff I keep in my notebook. And that's what they did. And they made it their own. And I think it was a real lifesaver for a lot of them. So when learners understand how their brain works, they become more motivated, more persistent, better able to regulate their learning. And, research, and it's in this Edutopia article, learning physically changes the brain. So even when there's confusion happening, that means there's learning happening. It's the brain's trying to figure it out. And there's been research that they refer to about believing I can get smarter will actually increase their effort and persistence and achievement. And as I noted earlier, I did share a lot of this information with my learners. I didn't use the words trauma and poverty. I talked about stress and anxiety and what the brain does when we're very stressed or we're very anxious or we're scared. And they were very interested in it, and they were interested in looking at the brain and how come, this important part stops working and this part takes over and what happens. And we talked a lot about it. But it also let me show them you can still learn and you can still succeed. And that was my goal with them. Full disclosure, I have a cat and she just woke up from her afternoon nap. So hopefully she won't interrupt the last few minutes. I love this one about, it's not what we do isn't just passing on knowledge to our learners. It's about awakening possibility in every student. And I still hold on to that every time I'm working with learners, really of any age, but especially for the adult learners, that there's some possibilities coming their way. So there are resources for you. Copy of the presentation. There's a toolkit with some more strategies. There's another one on low load study and organizational strategies. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I would like to thank Summer for inviting me back for a second time. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here for this long. And I hope that you found it valuable. And I'd like to thank your funder for making it possible for me to be here. I love sharing this information, and Yes, so I hope that you found it valuable, and I'm always reachable if anybody has any questions.